Welcome back from lunch, everyone. I think we're about ready to start the afternoon panel. Our panel this afternoon will shed light on many of the topics we've discussed this week, the liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences, for instance, from their unique perspective as educators in honors colleges. Benjamin Lockhart is professor of English at the Frederick Meyer Honors College at Grand Valley State University, where he has received the Alumni Association's Outstanding Educator Award. He is the author of The Sacred Marriage, Psychic Integration, and the Faerie Queene, and Ethereal Rumours, T.S. Eliot's Physics and Poetics, and has served as president of the T.S. Eliot Society. Barbara Elliott is a professor in the Honors College at Houston Baptist University. She's the founder and president of the Center for Cultural Renewal, a resource center for faith-based organizations working to renew communities in the U.S. Dr. Elliott is also the founder of the WorkFaith Connection, a nonprofit in Houston that transitions people out of prison, homelessness, unemployment, or addiction into a new job and a new life. The Manhattan Institute gave her the Social Entrepreneurship Award in 2011. Jonathan White is professor of interdisciplinary studies in the Frederick Meyer Honors College at Grand Valley, also the executive director of Grand Valley's Homeland Defensive Initiative. White is a national expert on the topic of terrorism and religious extremism and teaches classes on these subjects for the state and local anti-terrorism training program of the United States Department of Justice. Dr. White has also taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Jeffrey Chamberlain is director of the Frederick Meyer Honors College at Grand Valley, a position he's held since 2007. Before arriving at Grand Valley, Dr. Chamberlain served as professor of history at the University of St. Francis. As an historian, his specialty is 17th and 18th century England, with an emphasis on the social, political, intellectual, and ecclesiastical movements of the time. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
I'd like to begin by saying thank you to my good friend, Gleaves, for putting this together and for asking me to be here. This has been quite an experience, Gleaves, and teaching with you and team teaching in the Honors College last year was the teaching highlight of my 35 years, and I really have appreciated it. I also would like to say publicly that thank you, Ben. He edited a book written by some guy named Jonathan White on the Prussian Army, 1640 to 1871, which 3 people outside my family have actually read. It's quite an honor to be up here with people that you respect and admire. We're going to go through the paces. We'll start with Jeff and just work our way down and then open it up to questions and comments from everyone in the audience. So, Jeff?
Thank you, John. Much appreciated, and I too am delighted. Thank you, Gleaves, and thanks to the Hauenstein Center for putting this on. This is a tremendous step in the direction of being able to bring people together and to find common ground so needed today. I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of a sense of my background and what I think has been, it's been serendipitous, I think, in terms of helping me to find ways that I can contribute to common ground. I feel a little bit of a sympathetic sense with a character from a book that I read when I was in India many years ago. I was in India and I was experiencing some very, very, very different kinds of backgrounds than I had ever seen before. Situations, circumstances, lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. And I read a book, kept me really occupied because it's about a 1,000-page historical novel called The Far Pavilions by MMK. And I was just taken by it, completely absorbed by it. But one thing stuck out from that book. There's a character. It's about the time towards when the British are in control in the 19th century. And there's a character in it. The whole thing is a love story. You'll get really wrapped up in it if you get to that part. But the basic part of it is there's a character named Ashton who is British by birth, but he's raised in an Indian context and really gets to understand the Indian context. And then he is taken to be schooled in England. And he comes back to India with both sides, understanding both sides in very, very significant ways because he's lived both sides. And he comes back and he sometimes feels he's cursed because he doesn't know which way to go all the time. Because, in fact, he understands both perspectives, both of the colonialists, who we now pretty much like to pan as having been bad as an influence, but also of the Indians. And he goes back and forth and can actually end up being a mediator because of that, even though the sides ultimately still clash. And I thought about that character a lot because my own experience has been one where I have bounced from one kind of background, one kind of education to another. So in fact, I started my education in Bible college before I went to a Christian liberal arts college called William Jennings Bryan College. Some of you may recognize it. It's actually been in the news recently. I don't know if you've seen it. It's been in the New York Times. This school that has less than 1,000 students has been in the New York Times because some of the science professors want to teach the possibility of evolution and are being roundly condemned by the administration of the school. And it's really interesting because even when I was there, that same question was always lingering there. But I knew very much the evangelical perspective, the fear of confronting science in this secular kind of background. And so I got that sense. I went on to seminary after that. And I went on to get an MDiv at a conservative evangelical seminary. And in fact, there was one point in time when I had professors. Two professors I knew and respected, got a lot out of. They told a story about how they had made a pact with each other that if they ever became liberal, they would resign. That this pact was what was holding them to become or stay conservative and not be tempted to get into the liberal side. And at first I was so impressed by that. Wow, what dedication, what commitment. But over the years I started to think, that was dumb. If what they believed was really the truth, and if they could use the information that they could discover, the evidence, and find out that that was really the truth, why did they have to create this pact? You know, the pact was, in a sense, an effort to stay away from the exploration of other possibilities. Well, so I was at the seminary, and then I went to the University of Chicago. That was a slightly different experience because you couldn't even find a Bible in the divinity school. And so I heard completely different sides at that point in time. And you know what? It was challenging. It was difficult. It was a looking at different sides of things that I had never looked at before, but I learned huge amounts, not only about history, which is my field, but about philosophy, about different ways of looking at religion. I had some of the most famous academics as my grad school. In fact, I heard this morning there was a comment I think John Zimmerman made about some of these great schools don't always have the best circumstances. I had Martin Marty as a professor and was privileged to do so. But what was amazing to me about his seminar is he would not say a word until the very end of the seminar. He'd just let the students talk, and he'd sit there and write away, and we didn't know what he was doing. We thought maybe he was writing in his next book while we were talking about something else. At the very end, he'd throw in comments and do some name dropping, but would really pull some things together in an amazing way. So then I went to teach at a small Catholic college, which, if you don't know, the Catholic college environment is very different from the evangelical environment. I learned a lot and really loved it. I enjoyed that environment a lot. They took me to Rome about 5 or 6 times and, in fact, tried to pull me into the mother church of the Jesuits and say, let's pray that they get back to their mission. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I don't think I want to pray that prayer. Because if you know the Jesuits, of course, they were a counter-Reformation out to pull the Protestants back into the fold, and if they couldn't, maybe do some harm. But in any case, it was a tremendous window into that world, and I learned so much. And then I did want to have the public university experience, and so now at Grand Valley, it's different yet again. And I feel just as comfortable at Grand Valley as I did at any other institution. And what is so valuable for me now, having had that background, is that I can speak to people from all of these different kinds of backgrounds. I don't necessarily even tell my students what my own perspectives are. I bring them out to talk about theirs. I will try to channel the conversation, and I will encourage them, because I've had this experience. If I just did this the other day, a student wanted to take American civilization, a long, year-long sequence. She'd come in with AP American history. I said, why don't you take Islamic Middle East? Because that's going to give you some experience. That's going to give you some background that you don't have. And the more of that you get, the better off you can be. And it seems to me that ultimately, what we need to have and what our liberal education ought to be doing as we encourage students to look at different authors, to understand different perspectives, to look at the world, to travel, to go abroad and try different cultures. We need more of these people who can see these different sides, if for no other reason, to be mediators between these worlds. And that's what I would hope we would bring to it. There are a lot of other things that I could add to it, but I think I'm probably getting close to my 10 minutes. So I'm gonna leave it at that, and we can come back and address other issues as we go. Thank you.
Well, since my colleague here has explained a little bit about his background, I will just briefly in mine, only because it's a little all over the place as his was. I started off my career at Hillsdale College, actually, not too far from here. Had a chapter of my life in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill and then working in the White House, and then moved across the seas, and I was a PBS reporter for a number of years, reporting on economic and political stories. Left that to do outreach to refugees who were fleeing communism just as the Berlin Wall came down, and ended up writing a book about them. And they came back and spent the last, well, almost 18 years, I guess, working with inner city groups, homeless people, people coming out of prison, people leaving gangs, at-risk kids in elementary schools, and have had a lot of experience with really broken lives. Started a couple organizations along the way. Anyways, so at this late date in my life, I had the wonderful opportunity to begin teaching at Houston Baptist University in their honors college. And it's just a gift. I mean, after 20 years of, and I loved it, of so many broken people really trying to rebuild a life, I get to speak with people who aren't yet wrecked. They're not yet crack addicts. You know, they haven't been in prison 7 times. You know, it's glorious. I don't know what their future will be, but, you know, at least it's a chance now. And in that time, I've just had a marvelous opportunity to put into practice now what the other side of my life, which has been as a lifelong learner. I read, I discuss. Gleaves has been a wonderful, wonderful friend to allow so many opportunities to come and be a part of things here, and I thank you for that. My husband Winston and Brad Berzer, and we've had a number of folks who have just been a part of a community of learning. Ben Lockett as well. We've known each other, and we've fostered the intellectual growth in the context of friendship, as Chris Nelson talked to us about. It is about friendship. And a part of what that has led to in the Honors College where I am, it is Houston Baptist University. I am not Baptist, but all faiths are welcome there. But it is a Christian university. We don't cram it down anybody's throat, but that is the beginning place, and all of the other disciplines will take their own shape, but the teachers who teach there can at least share the Apostles' Creed in those tenets. So, having said that, when we approach the subjects in the Honors College, in a sense, we are looking at the kind of approach that C.S. Lewis gave. Brad talked to us about one of his books yesterday, but it's The Abolition of Man that I'm thinking about. And C.S. Lewis writes in the little appendix at the end of it about what he calls the Tao, or Ta also, but 2 essential understandings of an overarching transcendent order, a moral order. He says that the Chinese considered the Tao, the Tao, to be the greatest thing. It is the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is the nature, it is the way, it is the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on. the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. And it's also the way that every person should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that exemplar. Lewis then puts together in a little tiny digest what he very modestly says is just his perusal of the subject, but he looks at the kinds of moral conclusions that various civilizations have reached. And he looks at the ancient Babylonians, ancient Egyptians, Australian Aborigines, ancient Indians, as well as ancient Jewish teachings, Old Norse, Roman, Hindu, and Chinese writings. And what he finds there, to use the term for this conference, he finds a common ground. He finds that they agree upon, in a stunningly similar way, the basic tenets of human life. He who chooses the good chooses to live this way. Honor your father and mother. Do not steal. Do not murder. Protect the weak. Look after the widows and orphans. Honor God. Show kindness. Speak with goodwill. And Lewis offers this really as evidence that there is an overarching understanding of what it is to be a human person, and that whatever shape it takes in different civilizations, it is rooted in one transcendent truth. He says it gives us the ability to discern between good and evil, and also between the sublime and the merely pleasing, which was the subject of his book. He says this allows us to develop the habits of the heart to discern correctly and to bring ourselves into the alignment with the truth that lies outside us. Now, if we approach the liberal arts that way, we're starting from a premise that there is truth, that it is knowable, although not necessarily easily knowable, but that we are given both reason and faith, and that they run in tandem with one another. One does not operate to the exclusion of the other. The tradition in which the liberal arts came about was from the church. That was initially where the universities were coming. But the wisdom can be traced all the way back through Boethius and Augustine to Plato and Socrates, and even before that to Pythagoras. And there was a kind of a harmony in what they were describing, which led to a unity of truth and goodness and beauty, and that they are related to one another and rooted in the same place. And in fact, the Greeks even concluded there was also a numerical element of beauty, that the proportions that were used in building the Parthenon had something to do with the ideal form, human form, that Praxiteles was making in statuary. So the proportions of the hand to the arm and the upper thigh to the lower thigh. There was something numerical that made that the ideal form of beauty, just as Pythagoras discovered that there was something in the length of a string plucked this way compared to half of the length of a string plucked, compared to a third of that, and then a third with a fifth together, and that was harmonious. It was pleasing to the ear. So Pythagoras was pointing us toward, as the Greeks did, the idea that numbers and harmony and beauty and truth are somehow related. At the very essence, the truths of science, numbers, have something to do with the other side of it, by which we describe beauty and truth. And it was only the division later in education that pulled those concepts apart. Initially, it was the trivium and the quadrivium. We were dealing with the verbal arts, essentially, and then those concerning numbers. So later, with mathematics, with essentially arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and also music, before that, having learned how to read and write, essentially. Stratford Caldecott, a British author in Oxford, I don't know if you know his works, wonderful, beautiful soul, and very, very challenging, interesting books. He wrote a book called Beauty for Truth's Sake. And in it, he is suggesting that the way to go back to the unity of these 7 arts of the liberal arts is to go back to the origin, a ressourcement, if you will, as in the Renaissance, look back to the earlier, well, this is going back to the originals. And see, he's saying that the language of the universe is also found in numbers. He's saying that the wisdom that he found there is the kind of thing that can lead us to a greater appreciation of that beyond which our own knowing cannot reach. And he says that, in fact, many people who do pursue that in science end up coming to an acknowledgement of a divine maker because there is no explanation for which a human solution would be adequate. He is saying that Plato showed us that philosophy showed us how to live well and also how to die well, and that the liberal arts were essentially to teach a person how to live as a full human being with a full-orbed understanding of knowledge and our limitations, and that is a good in and of itself. It isn't to get us something which we can then sell as a profession. It is, in and of itself, the best way to become a full human being with all capabilities unfolded and the ability to continue to learn throughout life. We're not finished when we get out of undergraduate school or even graduate school. It's a lifelong endeavor. And learning these 7 disciplines is a way that he contends, and that many educators have contended, that will actually get us there. At Houston Baptist University in the Honors College, we are doing an all great books program for our Honors College students. They major in other things. I mean, everything from history to literature. I have 2 studying to be concert pianists. I've had 2 who want to go into government. I've tried to dissuade them, but to no avail. But what we're doing is essentially engaging the text. So we don't lecture. They read it, we ask questions, they ask questions back. Sometimes they get very frustrated. I had one who just gave me a scathing review in our evaluations at the end of the semester last year. He said, the professor will not give us the answer to important questions. I asked her, what is the best form of government for Christianity? And she said, what do you think? Well, obviously that student understood eventually, I hope, what we were getting at. I don't give them the answer. Of course I have an opinion. But if I push the question back, I found that after 3 more subsequent conversations among the whole class, they came up with very good answers. But they owned those answers because they had to tussle it out. They had to think, and they have to write. So, to explain just a little bit, and I won't take too much more time, Christian faith is at the root of what we do there, but it is with an awareness of the legitimacy and the importance of both Athens and Jerusalem. This is not a know-nothing kind of approach. It is to push the mind as far as we can go, but to acknowledge that both faith and reason are legitimate and necessary. As far as the diversity question, Houston has now become the most ethnically diverse city in the United States. We just passed up LA and New York. It is the largest concentration of Nigerians outside Nigeria. We have very significant Vietnamese populations, people from the Philippines. It's become kind of a magnet for refugees. It's people from all over the world. I think we have 100 languages spoken in our elementary schools. And we get a lot of the students at Houston Baptist who they'll be the first ones in their family to go to a university at all. That's fairly common. So the idea that they're coming in with some sort of, preformed notions or even a politicized view of what an education is just so far from the mark. Our job is to teach them how to think. Not what to think, but how to think. And to trust that they will arrive at good answers if they are pursuing it with an honest heart. We don't bring our ideology into the classroom. No one does. I don't think anybody in my class, I don't think they know what faith I am necessarily, and they certainly don't know much about what I think about the rest of it, because we are dealing in the pre-political realm. It's infinitely more important. What is true? What's just? How do you bring that about in a human realm? And the other realms are derivative from that. That is the centrality. We think that a cultivated intellect is, in and of itself, the most important thing they can have. I'm going to leave you with this. Stratford Caldecott, at the end of his book, says, faith orients us through reason toward the transcendent, so that reason remains open to a light from above. The intellect must seek that which it loves. The more it loves, the more it desires to know. Faith and reason are 2 wings, but unless we develop some sense of what lies above faith and reason, as well as what lies below, the art of flight will elude us. A disenchanted world is viewed through the eyes of reason when reason is looking downward. One wing droops, no longer reaching for the sky. Even if the wing of faith flaps frantically on the other side, the person will remain earthbound. The things it sees will become opaque and dark, no longer radiant, because they will no longer possess an interior or any intrinsic relationship to the ideas and the wisdom and the love of God. This is the world of darkness and dust that many of us inhabit. But it is as easy and as difficult as it has always been to raise our heads to the sky. The angels are closer than we think, and the way is open. The intellect seeks truth, and it seeks beauty for truth's sake. But the substance of truth is love.
Might need to take a break or something. That was too good. Just as I began my college teaching career 30 years ago, the whole academy seemed to have accepted as axiomatic the assertion that everything is political. And that's what I want to talk about. This self-evident universal truth, and curiously, my relativistic colleagues have quite a few absolutes, came to be uttered frequently in response to complaints from a few recalcitrant professors who objected when other professors used their scholarly publications and their courses to promote their political views. The argument was that since everything is political, all scholarship and teaching is necessarily promoting political views. Those who pretended to be objective and apolitical in their teaching were implicitly and unconsciously supporting a conservative position. It is preferable, the argument continues, to make the political assumptions of one's courses explicit, allowing the students to consider consciously the ultimate political consequences of the materials on which the professor has chosen to focus. Because this argument makes some sense, it deserves some careful consideration, and I think if we think of it in the context of liberal education, it becomes incoherent. In the early days of my time at GVSU, a proposal for a new general education core curriculum explicitly adopted the political assumption as one of its basic principles. The proposal said this: the inevitably political dimension of culture, the senses in which any cultural expression is also an expression of power relationships based on race, class, gender, religion, and nationality. That's the starting point for this proposal. This is a dangerous half-truth, which should not be adopted as the core idea of a core curriculum. As David Bromwich points out in the beginning of his excellent book, Politics by Other Means, and these are Bromwich's words, politics is not education. The means make a difference to the end. During that curricular debate, I felt some sympathy, actually, with the statement that everything is political. The political arena, after all, is a context that affects everything within a polity, including education. For that reason, political philosophy has long held an honored position in the academy. In fact, Aristotle calls politics the master science. However, when he says this, he is considering education, I think, from a practical point of view. For the science of politics, he says, determines which sciences ought to exist in states, what kind of sciences each group of citizens must learn, and what degree of proficiency each must attain. When we deliberate about our curriculum, what we are doing is political in this way, and those curricular debates become highly politicized, necessarily so. For we're deciding what sciences or disciplines students should learn. Although Aristotle calls politics the master science in this sense, I don't think it would ever have entered his mind to focus an educational program on current political issues. If politicians must determine the place of the other disciplines in the state, I believe he would agree, they must know those other disciplines in themselves, not merely as manifestations of Nietzschean power relations. Similarly, Plato in the Republic sees the whole educational process leading toward just governance. Only the best philosophers will rule in his republic. But this does not mean for him that political issues are given pride of place in the fundamental course of studies his future guardians pursue. Professors today should try to hold these two thoughts in their minds at the same time. Everything is political, but politics isn't everything. It is precisely because politics is an art which encompasses all others in practical life that political issues of the moment must be distanced from a liberal education. An exaggerated emphasis on politics in the curriculum and in the classroom causes academic disciplines to cease functioning as they should. As the word implies, a discipline trains us to think in certain ways and with a certain control. Our disciplines may narrow our field of vision, but they also clarify our insights. They help keep us from making wild, unsubstantiated generalizations about our materials, though I find I do that anyway, but the discipline is meant to bring that under control. The disciplines try with some success to make our thinking more precise, more reasonable, and more objective. It is a mistake to design courses and curricula to focus on political assumptions as the ultimate meaning of all academic inquiry. Our approach should remain liberal in the educational sense, the free search of the mind for truths about ourselves and the world. I derive this definition partly from Mark Van Doren's fine book, Liberal Education. There he writes that liberal education is education in the liberal arts, which are the thinking arts, as opposed to practical arts such as engineering, farming, or carpentry, or the fine arts such as music, sculpture, or dance. Liberal means free, and a liberal education is free in the sense that it is free of practical goals. We study our language and our literature, or biology and chemistry and psychology, just because it is a human instinct to do so. As Aristotle said at the beginning of the Metaphysics, men by nature desire to know. We practice the liberal arts and seek a liberal education because we are driven by our very nature to do so. Even Cardinal Newman, when writing about the proper role of a liberal education in a Catholic university, says that a liberal education does not serve the purpose of producing morally upright people, which is quite a remarkable statement coming from him. It makes, he says, not the Christian, but the gentleman, by which he means someone who has what he calls the philosophical habit of mind. Our students do not take away knowledge and skills that have immediate applicability in the practical world from a liberal education. In fact, I promised my honor students at the beginning of the course sequence that they'll never learn anything useful. And I believe I've always kept that promise. Nevertheless, we know that people who possess the thinking, speaking, and writing abilities that are fostered in our courses are able to analyze problems and discover solutions in any practical circumstance, and will therefore become leaders in all fields. But the profound usefulness of a liberal education is attained paradoxically by not aiming at utility. And this paradox is easily forgotten by well-intentioned people who want to use liberal education to make good citizens. They become what Bromwich calls the new fundamentalists. I'd like to give an example of the kind of politicized teaching that has come to dominate my field of English literature. I was teaching Shakespeare's Tempest this last semester, and I found that a significant number of students wanted to discuss the play in the context of post-colonial theory. It's perfectly legitimate to think of colonizing as one of the themes of the play. It has long been recognized that the name Caliban is an anagram of cannibal, and that Shakespeare had read Montaigne's essay Of Cannibals, in which Montaigne argues that the native people of the New World are in some ways superior to their European conquerors. Shakespeare presents Caliban, the native of the island who has been enslaved by Prospero, in a somewhat sympathetic light, especially when he rhapsodizes about the noises of the isle in some of the most beautiful lines of the play. Sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Caliban claims with some reason, "This island's mine by Sycorax, my mother." accusing Prospero of having taken it from him. So it's perfectly legitimate as one interpretation of the play to consider the colonial experience or the colonizing experience that was beginning in the New World at that time. However, there are some problems with the post-colonial interpretation. Perhaps the biggest problem is that the students weren't interested in other themes in the play. The post-colonial interpretation did not leave room for them. Why did they have such a narrow view of such a richly varied work? It turned out that they had taken world literature, a subject that has largely displaced English literature in our curriculum, from one of two professors who liked to present Shakespeare's play alongside a play by a Francophone writer from Martinique, M.A. Césaire. In his play called A Tempest, Césaire presents Prospero explicitly as a colonial ruler who has enslaved a mulatto named Ariel and a black man named Caliban. I found that my students had more or less been taught to read Césaire's approach back into Shakespeare's play as if the modern writer had revealed the true and basically the only meaning of the earlier drama. This overlay, though again interesting and legitimate to think about, is quite reductive, and it drastically simplifies one's reading of The Tempest. There are problems. For one thing, Sycorax was not exactly a native of the island, but was banished there from Algiers for very, very bad behavior. Caliban claims to have been king of the island, but king of what subjects? He and Ariel were the only beings on the island when Prospero and Miranda arrived. And they came not as colonizers, but as people who had had everything taken from them and had been set adrift in a boat to die. At the end of the play, the Italians all leave with no apparent intent of claiming, controlling, or colonizing the island, which appears to have no commercial potential at all. So those are some limitations obvious in the play, I think, to that reading. Still, Prospero does treat Caliban as a slave. However, he says that he did not initially enslave Caliban, and the latter confirms it. Caliban says, when thou camest first, thou strokest me and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light and how the less that burn by day and night, and then I loved thee. What occasioned the change in their relationship? Prospero says angrily, I lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child. One of my students who had not been in the World Lit class pointed these lines out in the discussion, arguing that it was fairly reasonable for Prospero to exercise control over someone who had tried to rape his daughter. However, the novices of post-colonial theory were ready for this. One suggested that to violate the honor of a woman might not mean rape. It does. And then went on to describe a scenario in which Miranda was teaching Caliban, began to fall in love with him, and then drew back from those feelings because of the prejudice she had learned from her father, and then accused him falsely of rape. In response to that idea, which has no textual evidence, another student said, well, wait a minute, Caliban himself confirms that it was an attempted rape when he responds, oh ho, where it had been done. Thou didst prevent me. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans. This textual evidence still had no effect on the post-colonialist students. One of them suggested that both Miranda and Caliban were mentally colonized by Prospero in such a way that they both imagined there had been an attempted rape. At this point, there's nothing you can do. These students had been so thoroughly indoctrinated in this view as the only way to look at the play that their own minds had been so completely colonized by the post-colonialist colleagues of mine that the textual evidence simply didn't matter. I did say one thing that took them aback a bit. I asked what would happen if a feminist critic had overheard our discussion. Would she not accuse the post-colonial theorists of blaming the victim when they suggested that Miranda brought Caliban's behavior on herself by expressing romantic feelings for him? Here is one other problem with the politicized theories. they tend to contradict each other, as when Somalian feminist Ayaan Hirsa Ali was disinvited as commencement speaker by Brown University, where apparently being pro-Islam trumps being pro-woman. Another way the post-colonial reading of The Tempest distorts the play is by making Prospero the villain. Shakespeare doesn't present him as flawless by any means. He's crabby, he's pedantic. I said to the students, I like him, he reminds me of myself. So he's not presented as flawless, but he is someone who has been betrayed and who now has his enemies in his power, and yet he chooses to forgive them. On the final exam, I asked students to identify quotations from Shakespeare's plays and to comment briefly on a theme evident in each quotation. And I'll just conclude with this example. Here's the passage or a passage that I put on the exam. In this, Ariel has been expressing some pity for Prospero's enemies, whom he's been punishing pretty badly, and Prospero says, "Do you feel bad for them?" He says, "Yeah, I do." And Prospero says this, "Hast thou, Ariel, which art but air, a touch, a feeling of their afflictions, and shall not myself, one of their own kind, that relish all as sharply passion as they, be kindlier moved than thou art? Though with their high wrongs I am struck to the quick, yet with my nobler reason, 'gainst my fury do I take part. The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. They being penitent, the sole drift of my purpose doth extend, not a frown further." And he forgives them. I was looking for students to identify the theme of penitence and forgiveness, or that of reason and anger. But here's what one of the students wrote. "This passage demonstrates the theme of colonization." Oh, geez. "Here, spirits and humans are clearly positioned on separate levels from one another. As such, the audience is introduced to the idealizations of colonizing and the search for power." No points for that. 0 points for that answer. It's completely wrong. There's nothing in the text to call forth that answer at all. Now, this is just one student, answering one question. It's as anecdotal as you can get. But this is a pretty common experience now in literary studies, where my point is not that this student got the wrong answer, but that this politicized approach is not opening minds, it's narrowing them. And that's my objection.
Thank you, Ben. Well, I'd like to begin by quoting my second favorite philosopher. My first favorite philosopher is Immanuel Kant, but I can't understand German no matter what language it's in. So I will cite my second favorite philosopher, George Costanza of Seinfeld, who said, "There's friendship, George, and there's marriage, George. Worlds in collision, Jerry." That is the story of my academic life as terrorism drove me to ordained ministry. So if there are contradictions in this, I'm happy with my contradictions and in collision. Let me invite you to my history of war class for just a moment. It's going to be the second week if it goes like normal semesters go. The students have read Victor Davis Hansen's The Western Way of War. They know what a phalanx is. They know how the city-states line up. They know how they fight. And we move to 290 BC. Darius has arrived with a Persian army, a large Persian army. They've disembarked their ships and they're along a beach just outside a village called Marathon. 10,000 Athenians have marched there, 10 generals. The generals have to vote. There's an idea that's just about right. The generals have to vote on what they're going to do. They have an 11th general, a Polemarch. His only function, to vote if there's a tie, like vice president in the Senate. Miltiades, the lead general that year, has argued we need to attack the Persians. Why? Because Darius left a force on the beach that still outnumbers the Greeks. Sailed around, coming to undefended Athens. Miltiades argues we must attack, we must destroy these folks, then get to Athens as fast as we can. The generals vote 5-5. Miltiades looks at Callimachus. Well, Callimachus, it rests with you. Callimachus says, attack Miltiades. Miltiades doesn't have as many Greeks as Persians on the beach. There's a hill here, a hill here, a road to Athens, and Miltiades is on the high ground. He takes his phalanx and stretches it out, then reinforces each end. He says a prayer, gives his battle speech, puts on his helmet, and lowers his spear. Young boys and old men have their hoplons up. They have their 8-footers, their spears sharpened on each end. There are men shaking, some men crying, some men defecating and urinating, throwing up. This is real. They look down the hill. At this point, I stop the class and look at my students and say, everything I'm telling you is a lie. What? Yeah, everything I'm telling you is a lie. What do you mean? Oh, I wasn't there. I have no idea. I've read a lot about this, and I haven't read it in the Greek because I can read Koine Greek, but I can't read classical Greek. I've read English translations. I've read military analysis of this. I've seen the ground. I've gone over the maps. I know the stories, but it's just a lie. I don't know what happened. This is my best guess. It's kind of like a movie. I'm just telling you what I think happened. And by the way, Miltiades didn't know what happened either. Why? Because he's over on this side of the line, if our information is correct, and he can't see what's going on over here. He's really hoping that this crazy phalanx that he has is going to surround those Persians. Indeed, that's what happened. But he doesn't know. Guys in the front, they don't know. Guys in the back, they can't see. Most of them aren't going to write this down. This is my best guess. Please question everything I tell you. Please look for yourself. Please don't accept me as your authority figure. Here's the story according to John. Then we resume. It's always a sobering moment each semester. Students come up and, now, you don't really mean that's a lie, do you? And I say, no, it's being euphemistic to get your attention, wake the people up who were sleeping, etc. But I don't want you to accept authority. About 6 years ago, I had the great privilege of moving from one college to the Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies and joining the Department of Liberal Studies. What a transformation, except the guys on my counter-terrorist team who think I'm a half-baked commie because I teach at a university. Now I have gone to the department once they introduced me at the FBI. Now he's in liberal studies. What a wonderful experience. We were free to combine disciplines, to take worlds in collision and put them together. And we were free, like Plato's Socrates, to constantly ask questions, say, I don't know, and end up with an apophatic conclusion in a complete mist. Wow. If we did that in our search for knowledge, the complete admission, unknowing, this is what we think, based on the evidence that we have right now. And I'm describing this to you in ordinary language. Today we call that science. We used to call it natural philosophy. Before that we simply called it philosophy. It's just ordinary language. I don't have the words. Now we make three grand fallacies, I think, when we teach, or at least I do. Fallacy one, science is objective. It's value-free. Right. It's a hard science. It deals with facts. Right. Science leads to truth. Okay. You believe that? In a wonderful book, a book that I love and I've read twice and I'm probably going to read again, Stephen Hawking's Grand Design, The Grand Design, he makes this statement: philosophy is dead. Then he writes a book about philosophy. And it's really a good philosophy book. I love it. I want to remember Feynman. If you say you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics. I want to remember Pythagoras. Look at the math. Keep taking the math. It all works. Oh, this is wonderful. I've reached a state of unknowing where math doesn't work. And he encounters the divine. We have to use mundane, ordinary language in the classroom, because mundane, ordinary language captures the postulates that we think are valid until we get new evidence. I loved Carl's statement yesterday about science being impeded. I can't remember it exactly, Carl, but it was so wonderful. Science being impeded by the guy hanging on to his theory. Einstein, God doesn't play dice with the universe. Bohr, yes he does, but they're very small dice. But we need an extraordinary language. An extraordinary language to capture the things we don't know. Art, poetry, music, narrative, and forgive me, neo-positivist, imagination. Students come to me, Dr. John, I want to do what you do. I want to study terrorism. Oh, fine, that's easy. Come to Gleaves, come to me, we'll help you do that. We have this great major, it's called Liberal Studies. You can design your own major. What, well, can I take terrorism courses? Oh, we have one. Well, I want to take more. You don't need it. We have political science courses. We have math courses. We have philosophy courses, geography courses, history courses. We can teach you how to write. That's what you need if you want to do this. Some of them say, wow. Some of them look for another program. That's the nature of things. They asked me, Dr. John, how many terrorism courses did you take? None. Well, what did you study? Miltiades, Scipio Africanus, Charlemagne, Machiavelli, and Aquinas and Augustine and St. Paul. Worlds in collision. We'll open it up now for questions. Deborah? Oh, sorry. While we're waiting for the microphone, the Greeks won.
So I've had this puzzle. Matthew and I have been talking in the evenings and really some fascinating conversations with many of you in the evenings and over lunches and dinners. And I find that I'm puzzled, and I'm working out several concepts in my own mind throughout this conference, and so it's been helpful to hear the perspectives of everyone. And so, Ben, you raised the case for me most clearly, so this isn't really for you. You just presented the best test case. But this question really is for everyone in the room, which is, how do we identify when something is politicized? So the case you gave of your students was very interesting, but I was sitting here thinking of my own experiences in the classroom, which have, in philosophy, but lots of parallels where I have students who wander in from other courses in philosophy, students who wander in from other disciplines, and I'm just trying to get them to read a text, Plato's Republic, for example. I can't get them to move off of some bizarre interpretation they're bringing in from history or political science, right, or economics, because they insist on reading everything from a background in economics. And I keep saying, but where is it in the text, right? This is a text-based course. And so other students will present them evidence from the text, and I will argue forcefully against their interpretation by giving them this other text over here, and we have this really fascinating discussion. So one question is, A, how do we know that something is politicized? It strikes me that's really the heart of this whole summit. Because in order to know how to move forward, we have to know how to identify it. It simply can't be something that someone is stuck. Because all students come to our material from whatever discipline with the benefit of their prior experience. And they use that as a filter. I refer to it as a lens. And so all background experience is a lens. So how do we know what politicization is?
Can I start? One of the things that's great you asked that, because one of the things that is coming out clearly through these conversations is the issue of coming to materials with a priori or background expectations or understanding of it. I mean, in history, it's always been interesting to me when students want to be history majors because they want the facts. They're tired of English because there are too many interpretations you can have in English, and so they become a historian so that they can just go to the facts. Yeah, good luck with that. As John was talking about, how do you get to the facts? I mean, they're mediated to us in such indirect ways that what ultimately gets to be a problem is epistemology. And so the way I've gone about addressing this is trying to deconstruct their interpretations when they're coming in first. And this is difficult, but I think this is a big part of the process of liberal education is looking at our own understanding and understanding that we're coming at something and not being afraid to let that go for a while. Maybe even as a temporary construct, let that go and feel free to look at another perspective. But then ultimately come back, as Ben was saying, and not take a bad interpretation because all interpretations are equal. Because you can easily get into a relativistic or a skeptical sense, this constructionistic sense that you can't really know everything. Everything is mediated by your own experience, by your own connections. You can easily get to that. So, I mean, that's where we also need to build in a sense of what is sometimes now called ethical reasoning or moral reasoning. So you're building from the evidence to something. But we have to get rid of these initial expectations we have. And the way I usually do that is by at first showing students who think that something is easy. I mean, even you take a traffic accident, right? I mean, this is a good illustration. How many different viewpoints? How difficult is it for somebody to know what happens in a traffic accident, even when there are 10 witnesses? You interview each witness, and they all have a different perspective of what happened. well, in my mind, something really did happen. You don't want to just say, well, we can't tell that anything happened. But you need to really work hard at reconstructing that, and as much as you possibly can. This is why the different interpretations are helpful. You need to help yourself get rid of the bias you come to it with in order to build that. And I really love the concept of common ground, because there we're not talking about there is no ground. We're all left in the air, but we need to find those places where we can agree, where we get to those interpretations that are more likely. I mean, you talked about how truth may be hard to get to, but there is something out there worth working towards in order to get there. But we all have to be a little humble in that process, too, because it means that we have to say, I don't know it all. I love John's way of doing that. It's like, okay, I just told you a lie. Well, that's great. It's a great way of doing that and getting that impression to the students, like, you don't know it all. We're really working on pulling this together as all seeking, as all working to find the answers.
Is this on? Oh, let me rephrase it. There's a great answer, but I think you gave me more of an answer about method, so how we address it, which is a wonderful answer. But the question I'm really getting at, and this is, Ben brought up the case, so it's not really for Ben, but it was the clearest example, is what licenses the judgment of anything being politicized? So I guess what worries me is I might, in the discipline of philosophy, I might think that someone who wanders, a student who's just taken a whole course in econ, wanders in and gives everything that spin and make the charge, that's been politicized. And think there's something problematic about the student's approach and then how I try to respond to the student. Or I might think that a student wanders in from a history course and they have a particular spin. Maybe they just took a course from Jewish history. And so they're viewing everything with that lens. What licenses the inference that that's been politicized rather than a different, alternate, and additional theoretical perspective that we are using in this common ground? And so part of me is wanting an answer to that deeper theoretical question.
Can I just
if
take
that makes sense.
a stab at that? I'm not sure that labeling each of those varying interpretations would be even justly called politicizing it. They would simply be faulty interpretations. I think we can always be on guard to try to walk an interpretation back. The way we do with it is stick to the text. Can you show me the line in the text? Every comment that is made in class, somebody may veer off that. Can we tether your comment to a place in the text? And if you get in the habit of looking to see what did Plato actually say about that, not what does somebody else think about it, you start to think a little more clearly about the intention of that author. And they may even disagree with each other. That's the great thing about teaching the great books. They disagree with each other. How refreshing. And as they're clashing with the ideas, then we have to figure out, okay, so what do you do with that? In dealing with the different ways of looking at history, a really nice tonic for that is go read some Herodotus or some Thucydides, and you realize that they wrote history in a different way. By the time you get to Gibbon, he's already not even allowing certain facts to be included in the collection. It's just very interesting. And if you've never read that, thinking, wow, there really is some selection going into this whole process of even writing what we call history. Of course, philosophy is another whole thing. But really encouraging students to develop the habit of mind to stick to the text. It's cleaner. It gives you a place to actually talk about the intention and try to pull the truth out of that without fuzzying it up with other things that are just irrelevant to it, I think. I don't know if that's helpful.
I'd like to answer that too. I think it's a really important question, and I think, but I want to give a simple answer, which is I think you know it when you see it. You got a creepy feeling down your spine. Does that help? No, and I actually asked myself after I'd finished writing this little talk, I said, wait a minute, that's not politicized, this post-colonial, because it's not an issue today. None of my conservative colleagues are saying, oh man, we got to get back to colonizing. That was really, the world was a much better place when the sun never set on British soil. There probably are people who are thinking that, but they wouldn't think it. So is it, I really thought, I thought your question, or at least a version of it, but I guess what I then answered to myself was that what I sense in this post-colonialist approach is passing on to the students sort of the grand liberal narrative of history, which sees everything as having been nothing but oppression until the Enlightenment, and then it's gotten better and better since then. It's not that conservatives don't have an opposing simplistic narrative where everything was great and it's gotten worse and worse, but I do think it's political in that way, and presenting that sort of sense of how history has progressed. And if you'll indulge me, I'll give another example. I walked into my classroom yesterday, and I had been at the conference and heard people saying you really weren't supposed to let your students know what you thought and so on. And I thought, oh, Jew, I'm bad about this, this is terrible. But I walked in and a colleague had put a poster on the board with literary theories. And it turned out this had been, one of my students who was in that class said, this is from a course on literature of ethnic minorities. And so I took an interest in that. And I also had my name tag on. The student said, why do you have your name tag on? I said, I was at this conference and passed around the brochure and talked to them about the conference a little bit. And so they said, let's look at the theories that are being presented by my colleague, whoever that is. And they were Marxist theory, feminist theory, queer theory, and post-structuralism, postmodernism. And I said, how many of those theories are essentially political theories? And they said, all of them. I said, well, not postmodernism, right? That's not a political theory. They said, well, they use it for political theory. It's used to support the political theories. So I think you can ask your students, are these essentially political ideas? And their answer was, yes, they are. Then let me finish. I then invited the students to come and hear me today, and said, you can hear me rant and rave for about 15 minutes tomorrow. And they said, no, we've had that. Twice a week for the last 6 weeks. But then I asked them, I said, because I thought, they know what I think. I'm not good at not saying this. And so I said, what do you think? Am I on the panel tomorrow, am I going to be one of the conservatives or one of the liberals? And about 3 students said, you're going to be one of the liberals. And about 3 said, you're going to be one of the conservatives, and the rest didn't know. And I thought, well, okay, probably they're not paying attention. Because just the class meeting before that, an issue of male-female relationships had come up, and somebody had been talking about how badly males behave and so on, and it was kind of the jackass theory was the terminology that they were using. And I said, so is that something that's, is that bad male behavior, is that purely socially constructed, or is part of that genetic? And so a couple of students jumped right in and said, that's totally a cultural construct, all that kind of behavior. And I said, wrong. It's not totally a cultural construct. So I thought, that was some really bad teaching, and certainly should have revealed my conservatism. I said, no, that's wrong. It's partly right, but if you make it absolute like that, it's almost self-evidently false, right? I think so. So anyway, But for some reason, some of them still thought I might be a liberal.
She had her hand up.
Oh, yes.
I want to ask Ben's question because we are apparently we teach in the same classroom, and I saw those posters, and I try to look at them, and I explain it to my student. I teach mythology, and I try to use some of those terms for the class. But I want to ask you about the example that you used. For if we flip the situation, the student actually take your Shakespeare class first, and then go to the world literature class, and then get exposed to post-colonial theory after they have done that. And I think that students' experience will be like, wow, this is a totally different perspective. And I think, wouldn't that be what liberal education is about? The student take different general education courses, and then they get different perspective. And for your class, when the student have already exposed to post-colonial theory, would that be a wonderful teaching moment for the student that you help them to deconstruct what they have learned, and then you getting a different perspective to look at the text and what did the text say? So in that sense, I think that's what liberal education is about, that students get exposed to different multiple perspective, and our student will get your Shakespearean Renaissance experts perspective, and then the world-lit professor.
Sure, I accept that in general, but I don't think it would work that way, Sue Fen, because if you reverse it, the students going into the other class would have heard the colonialist perspective. It's not that I introduced it myself, and then they took off and ran with it. It's clearly there. Shakespeare had read Montaigne. He quotes from Montaigne's essay. That's another more subtle question, though, how he handles that. And I would introduce a bunch of other perspectives. I don't think I am giving them just one way of reading a play like that. It would be foolish.
Can I just jump in really quickly? One thing that we do in the Honors College is simply, we're very clear about going in chronological order. So we start with the ancient Greeks, and then we do the ancient Romans, and then we move through the early church, the medieval period, and then the Renaissance, step by step. So they take a whole year just with the ancient Greeks and Romans, then we move on. So by the time they get to their junior year, we're going, revolution and modernity, and then one class just on the last 50 years. And then looking at all the things surrounding it, not just literature, not just history, but philosophy, art, music, all of it. But I think getting some sense of the continuity of history is just essential. Otherwise, it's these little snippets. You get one piece here, and it's the 18th century of this, and you get, the 15th century of that, and then you get just one on general science. It doesn't make any sense until you can put it in one continual line. Most people haven't ever learned that way. Then, if you want to introduce then the variations on it, you at least have a framework that you're comparing it to, and you'd get Shakespeare first, and then compare it to the more modern things. I just think pedagogically it just makes so much more sense.
Okay, so my caveat is that whenever a social scientist asks a question about a humanities, it's going to sound dumb. So please forgive me. It dawns on me that that in this discussion, sometimes the contrast has been between the text in itself and then these politicized readings. And I certainly do see that that's a kind of distinction. There are different ways of reading works, but it dawns on me that there's another way to think about this, which sort of pushes the politics out of it, I think, and maybe puts it in a different perspective. And that is that both the just read the text and the let's do a kind of post-colonial reading. Both of these are different versions of presentism, and so I'm in the back of my head here. I'm trying to channel Quentin Skinner, and it dawns on me that in either perspective, if you're just reading the text itself, the assumption is you're just reading the text because there's some kind of universal truth to which it speaks that you can mine and then appropriate for your own use. Or if you're reading from a kind of post-colonial standpoint, your assumption is that yes, there's this kind of narrative of history, and the text can be read from this point of view, and therefore it should inform somehow what we do today. And those are both readings of text that are very much oriented toward the present. But by virtue of being oriented toward the present, in a way, they are, distinctive, and they're very different from a kind of deeply contextualist account, in which the point is not to dismiss the text, but to recognize the degree to which the ideas, questions, assumptions, concerns of the authors are very much of that time and place, and may speak to broader issues, but are rooted in a very specific cultural and historical context, and that therefore we ought not just to read the text, but to read it in context, precisely so that we can be aware of the kind of radical otherness that history presents to us. And it dawns on me that that's something that's kind of not gotten much discussion here, and you could see that kind of contextual interpretation as having maybe a progressive. I mean, I'm not sure. It's indeterminate to me. But I'm hesitant to pose the distinction between a kind of proper text-focused reading and an improper, kind of politicized reading, and not recognize that there are quite other ways of slicing this, some of which might have pedagogical value in their own.
Yeah, Neil, that's a dumb question. Just messing with you. I think your historical. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're very right. This is part of the problem, is we can't get out of their current mindset, regardless of whether it's theory or our background informing it, or whether it's some other context in which we're getting it from. Frankly, that's why I think we need to explore different worlds. And the kinds of things I was starting with, I didn't get to the very end of what I'd hoped to do, but that's what's saying, you really need to experience different cultures, because as you experience those different cultures, you then are able to see things in different ways than your culturally conditioned presentist approach. I mean, that may sound crazy, but there's a fascinating illustration that I read not too long ago. Have any of you read this book by Kevin Roos called The Unlikely Disciple? He was a university student at Brown University, and he decided he wanted an international experience. He wanted to experience a different culture, but he didn't have the money to go abroad, so he applied to Liberty University. And he went to Liberty University for a semester, and it was a different culture. It changed entirely the way he saw people in that system. It changed entirely the way he then came back and viewed his own world. So, I mean, there are some ways. This is not the only kind of way of doing it. But, I mean, I think, again, it does make a difference if you can explore in a very, very different way. And sometimes texts can get us there, but sometimes it's actually, I was thinking, maybe I should not say this, but somebody said, internships in certain organizations that are politicized. But if you went to one that was a very different political side from one you are part of, all of a sudden you see those people there in a different way. All of a sudden you understand and communicate better. You may not, and hopefully you won't, just jump over perspectives, but you'll have a way of communicating better, and you'll be able to see this perspective of your own background better in that sense.
Let me just jump in quickly. We do try to teach the broader context in a conversation. I was just suggesting here, if you've got somebody who's wandering off, pulling them back and tethering a comment to a text is good. We do try to teach a whole culture, which is why we're not only reading Plato, we're also looking at Greek statuary and looking at their architecture and listening to the rudiments of music and trying to understand what was the Greek mind about. The ordering of mind was a great gift to the Greeks, really to all of Western civilization. So what was that about? And then when we get to the Romans, how are they thinking differently? Preoccupation with concrete and cleanliness and a whole variety of other things. But beauty, they kind of farmed that out to the Greeks, but to kind of get inside the mind of the people of a given time. And you get to the medieval period and they're, spinning their head but going, wow, this was really awful and really great all at the same time. And, but to get inside the culture. But we do that by going at it from different disciplines simultaneously. So, but I agree with, if it's presentism, looking at the text and just saying, well, this is what I see and this is what I think today and that's all there is, that of course would be not enough.
Yeah, we haven't been talking, except for Barbara, we haven't talked too much about honors colleges, but the honors college at Grand Valley, the humanities sequences do the same thing. And I teach in a 4-semester sequence that does Middle Ages the first year and Renaissance the second. And I teach with a historian, an art historian, and a philosopher. So that kind of setting, I think, helps to do what you're suggesting, Neil.
Another way that's really helpful, David Icke is here, another way that really can get you out of the presentist mindset to some extent. I mean, obviously it's impossible to do it entirely, but David does the Reacting to the Past program in his European civilization sequence and has become a real champion for that whole program, has written one of the games, the simulations. It's a simulation process. The one they started with was the French Revolution. And instead of simply reading a text about the French Revolution, they read the sources and then they simulate the factions in the French Revolution. They don't bring in a guillotine, so I don't worry about too much blood being shed. But they really get into the mindset in a different way. And in fact, Joe Hogan back there has spoken very, very highly of it, that it really revolutionized the way he was thinking about history and about the time and everything else, and gives very, very different perspective. So again, it's not perfect because it's a 21st century approach to getting out of presentism, which has issues. But it does do something beyond just reading the text from your own current mindset.
I'm told that there's a game called Assassin's Creed that does something like that. I haven't played it. My students know what it is. Anyway, let me read this. John Henry Newman said some intelligent things about what we've just been talking about. He said, a philosophical contemplation of knowledge as a whole leads to an appreciation of its separate departments. In an illumination and enlargement of the mind, it secures to the intellect the sight of things as they are, or of truth, in opposition to fancy, opinion, or theory. A little bit above that in the book, he says, the training of the intellect allows a person to discharge his duties to society. Its art is the art of social life, and its end is fitness for the world. A university training is the great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society, at cultivating the public mind, at purifying the national taste, at supplying true principles to popular enthusiasm, and fixed aims to popular aspiration, at giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age, at facilitating the exercise of political power and refining the intercourse of private life. It is the education which gives man a clear, conscious view of his own opinions and judgments, and a truth in developing them, a force in urging them. It teaches him to see things as they are, to go right to the point, to disentangle a skein of thought, to detect what is sophistry, and discard what is irrelevant. It prepares him to fill any post with credit and to master any subject with facility. He is at home in any society. He has a common ground with every class. He is able to listen. He can ask a question pertinently and gain a lesson seasonably. Common ground.
Well put.
Somebody else.
Okay. Thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your honors students, and with respect to these themes of liberal education and, as Professor Maurer raises, politicization, do you like them better than the ordinary student? Are they harder to teach? Jeff,
You go first.
Jeff, that's not fair. They're your bread and butter.
Yeah, they are hard to teach in the sense that a lot of them come in thinking they know everything already. And so, this idea of disabusing them of what they already know in order to reconstruct is sometimes more difficult. We actually are trying to get at that in the application process. One of the questions they can answer in an essay they write in the application process to honors is, how can you be both open-minded and still keep a sense of your identity? They can answer that in a lot of different ways. but it does show them from the very beginning, we want them to be thinking beyond what their background is. And so we try incrementally in every step of the way to be saying, look, you're gonna be asked to get out of your comfort zone, to get out of your preconceived ideas or your background's perspective on things, not because we want to change you necessarily, but we want you to think broadly, look at all these different issues. But sometimes it is a real challenge with honor students. They certainly are capable, and they're capable of playing the game better than any students you can imagine. But they are not always the quickest to really jump in and again get out of their comfort zone. They can talk more about the teaching process.
I'd say the greatest encounter I have is writing, and I warn them about this because they all believe they are extremely gifted writers that they never need to be corrected. And first day of class, I say, "You were a superstar. You could have gone anywhere you wanted." Yeah. You were the best in your high school, or among the best. Yeah. You just shined from everybody. And that's everybody in this class, and these are your new peers. And there's silence. And I say, when you give back your first paper with red ink all over it, I don't want you to be too devastated. And then I bring in some examples of chapters from my books that have been edited. Oh, gee, they did that to you? Yep, and I'm going to do it to you. It's always a shock for them.
Yeah.
That's great. I was team teaching a course with a colleague of mine from Classics, William Levitan, who just retired at the end of last term. And we've taught that together 3 times. It's kind of the Mutt and Jeff show because it's one of the, I was thinking about that with the Cornell West Robbie George thing because he and I disagree about everything. But then we were teaching this epic tradition course and we just kept agreeing with each other when it came to the literature. So that was a fun experience. But I started to say that I read an article about beloved teachers that said they were the beloved teachers were the harsh ones. And somebody said, gave an example of a student who said his music teacher in high school would give as his highest praise, not bad. And so I went in and talked. So I went into that day and showed the article to our brilliant class of students, and I said, I've been saying brilliant, great. That's over. It's from now on, not bad. That's all we get. So they need a little training in that way, but it's a joy, of course, to work with those students.
Judy, we're out of time, so please you go ahead.
I'll be fast then. So I was thinking about Deborah's question about how do we know when something is political, and I've wondered that myself in this conference. Like, what do we mean by that? And so if Marxism, structuralism, feminism, and post-colonialism is just all part of one is just categorized as a liberal agenda, then I don't know. If we're talking about Republicans and Democrats, then we can say, sure, we can say, I'm not being political in my classroom. Certainly, I'm not talking about Republicans and Democrats ever in my classroom. But I like to look for experiences that shock me, that make me see things differently and go, oh, I never saw that before. And so when I take a feminist perspective on John Dewey and look at the women that influenced him, and I suddenly read John Dewey differently, then I go, oh, that's so surprising. And those are the fun intellectual things to do. And so to take these perspectives and change these lenses and see things differently, I just don't think of that as a political thing to do. I think of that as, well, I think of it as fun. I think of it as an intellectual experiment to shift and to grow and to see things differently. So if that's political, that's weird to me.
Well, it is political, and you can tell that partly by what's missing as well as what's there, and that's what I noticed in my classroom yesterday. What's missing? Have they talked about Aristotle's Poetics? Have they talked about the Republic and what Plato says about the poets there? Have they talked about the other 100 approaches to literature. No, they have not.
Can I respond to that? I like to use the example because I teach mythology.
Excuse me. I think we got a microphone coming. Here it comes.
My voice is loud enough. I want to respond to that because I teach mythology and I started with Ovid. For example, if I use the myth of Arachne, you can usually read the text and talking about hubris. This is a woman who challenged the goddess and then get turned into a spider because of her hubris. But then I slowly guide the student to read the text in a different way. For example, there's textual evidence to show there is some sort of a class struggle because Arachne came from a low class, and then Athena Minerva represents sort of a higher class. And then from the thing they weave, show that kind of a class difference. So I'm using all the language about class struggle to interpret this myth this way, but that I don't use the lingual of Marxism. So I'm applying theory, but I'm not using the lingual. Is that politicized? And I'm doing that a lot in my mythology class. When I teach Zhuangzi, the Taoist mythology, I'm actually doing the deconstruction using the language theories and all that post-structuralist stuff, but I don't use the lingual. I don't use the term, but I'm applying the theory. So is that politicizing the approach?
Thanks for your question. Brief answers?
Yes.
Yes.
But what I do is, this goes against some of the things that we were talking about during Neil's excellent speech and our question and answer period. I tell him, look, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, except it's been hard for me to be a Republican since the 1980s. Thank you, Mr. Reagan. So I'm a man without a party. But when I say something, I take that back. It was not hard for me with H.W. or Bob Dole. But when I respond, I tell them, look, take that into account. Listen to your other professors. I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian pastor. That puts no obligation on you whatsoever. The only thing that means is that I have to teach you to treat you as a divine child of God according to my faith tradition. You can believe what you want. Listen to other people. I just share right up front. Everything's political.
You have the last word, I think. John, we're running out of time. Okay. I want to thank this fine panel for more insightful comments. I mean, this is such a feast. And very briefly, we're going to take a brief break and come into our last session at 3:30 with Deborah Maurer and Noreen Myers with what an intriguing title here, Marketing the Marketplace, Civility in Academia and Beyond. See you at 3:30.
Thank you.